My mother went to Eastern Washington University and stayed in one of the houses the locals rented out to college students. I cannot give the exact age of the house, but it was old enough to have a built-in button on the floor that would call up to the servants in the attic, so the house was relatively old. During her studies there she had 3 different roommates. My uncle was the first, who then was replaced by my mother's close friend, who was replaced by my father. All 3 of them can confirm change happenings in this house and be woken up in the middle of the night with people whispering. The worst of it was in my mother's room in the attic. My mother hated that house, but she didn't have anywhere else to live and the dorms were expensive, so she sucked it up and lived there until she graduated. She hated sleeping alone. The air in her room constantly felt thick and heavy. Her closet was constantly freezing cold, and at night she would hear multiple people whispering incoherent words at once. While living there, my mother had a cat named Puss who would constantly hide under the bed. One time my mother caught Puss out from under her bed, sitting, watching, and growling at one of the corners of the room. My mother went over to Puss, confused at what she was looking at, until she saw a black figure in the corner slowly start to move upwards toward the ceiling. Puss started to become more aggressive, her hissing and growling getting louder before she freaked out and shot off back under the bed, still growling at the corner until the black figure was gone. My mother had never seen Puss act like this, since Puss was usually a very loving and happy cat, but whatever that was clearly terrified her cat. Sometime later my mother was talking with a friend who was excited to be touring 2 famous paranormal investigators around the college and town, showing them supposed haunted places. My mother brought up the fact that she has always had weird stuff happening in her house and thinks it may be haunted. Her friend got excited and begged her to let him bring them to her house. My mother refused, since she wasn't willing to stay up late for some people that she doesn't even know. My mother didn't know at the time who these investigators were, since she never really kept up with paranormal stuff, believing it can let evil into your life. She only knew that they were on quite a few popular talk shows at the time. These 2 investigators were Ed and Lorraine Warren. Around midnight my mother's best friend comes to her and tells her that there are people at the door wanting to speak to her. Confused, my mother got in a robe and went to the front door. There she saw her tour guide friend with 12 other students behind Ed and Lorraine Warren. Lorraine asked my mother if they could come in, as their guide told them that it is possible her house is haunted. My mother agreed and let them all in. Lorraine asked my mother where in the house is the haunting more active, and my mother told her that it was in her bedroom, that she would take Ed and Lorraine there, but everyone else had to wait here. They agreed and my mother took Ed and Lorraine to her room. When my mother entered her room, she sat on her bed and asked if they could feel it, how heavy the air was. Ed and Lorraine agreed that the air was heavy, like how some of the haunted places they have been to. Lorraine walked around the room then to the closest and asked if she could hear voices here. My mother broke down crying and said she could hear them every night and that it kept her up at night. Lorraine told her that it was possible that her closest is a doorway for those who passed on, or a doorway to hell. My mother continued to cry before Lorraine came over to her and told her that the reason this stuff is happening to her is because of her mom's family, that the women have some connection with those beyond, and that it's possible that they are psychics, which makes the dead attracted to her. My mother then told Lorraine about the black figure, which Lorraine told her that wasn't from this house but was connected to her family, mainly her dad's side, and that it most likely went after her grandfather, her father, and now her. The figure isn't a ghost or a demon but something pure evil, and that it wants her. Fearful, my mother asked them if they could bless her room, which they did, and after further investigation of the house, Ed and Lorraine told her that her house was the first place that actually showed activity and signs of haunting in the whole area. After they finished blessing the house, Ed and Lorraine left. Time passed and my mom's best friend moved out and my dad moved in. The activity in the house still continued even after the blessing. At first, my father was skeptical of the house being haunted until one night while sleeping in my mom's bed he heard the whispering. He asked my mother what she said and she told him she didn't say anything. After a few moments of silence between them, she asked if he could hear them. Confused, my father asked what she was talking about and she told him the whispering. He then agreed that she heard the whispering and asked where it was coming from, which she then told her it was from the closest and it happens every night. Sometime after, my father got curious about whether or not the servants button still worked. Originally no one had ever been up into the attic. Both of my parents made their way up to the attic but never reached the top, since on their way there both of my parents left like they couldn't breathe as the temperatures dropped to the freezings, and my mother started to panic as she felt like she was being choked. She quickly told my father turn back around because it felt as though they were not wanted up there. Not wanting to upset my mother more, my father agreed and turned back around, never to go up there again. Once my mother graduated college, they moved out of the house, and strange events continued to happen no matter where they moved. Around the time I was born, my parents lived in a rather small house with my 2 older brothers. Constantly our cats would freak out, growling and hissing at the corners of the house. Not only that, but my mother would constantly see this black figure around the house. Later, my family had our new house constructed and we moved out of our old one. These strange events followed us and got worse. One day when I was around 5, I was walking outside my room to walk downstairs. The moment I walked to the balcony, I felt someone grab my arm extremely roughly. I turn around and I just see a black figure holding my arm. I scream for my mother. My mother came running upstairs and she sees the black figure. She grabs my arm and tries to pull me away, but the figure will not let me go. She pulled as hard as she could and ripped me away from the black figure. As she does, the figure disappears and a giant hand mark is left on my arm. My mother runs downstairs and screams at my father to get my brothers and that they are leaving the house until it is blessed. We later had a priest come to our house and bless it. Afterward the activity stopped, but growing up, me and my second older brother would constantly have nightmares of this figure in our dreams doing awful things to us, but it had bright red eyes and would chase us. Nothing else has happened since then and I still live in the house, but every while I get this sudden fear from the staircase. I never go downstairs at night without the lights on out of fear of this thing that is possibly still here. I had spoken to my mother about the dreams and stuff that happened to her, but she tries to avoid talking about it since she believes the more we talk about it, the more it would come back. She has told me though that she spoke with my grandfather about this figure, who refused to talk much about it since the first time she brought it up he went pale as a ghost. He said that the figure used to torment him as a child and his dad would tell him about the figure and how it would come for him as it did with him. My mother didn't realize that it was Ed and Lorraine Warren until we were watching a documentary about them, and she points out that they were the ones who came to her house. I was speechless and she was confused as I told her that they were the Ed and Lorraine Warren, the most famous paranormal investigators, that they were the ones who started publicly doing paranormal investigations, and there are famous horror movies that involve them. My mother freaks out and tells my father about it, and while my father was shocked, he didn't think much of it. I apologize if my story is a little all over the place, but this was my best attempt to explain my mother's story and my experience, since my mother doesn't like to talk about it much out of fear.